One of the reading resolutions I made for 2026 was to not purchase any new books until I had worked through the majority of my physical TBR stack, because I got a little bit excited with book purchasing last year and I ended up acquiring books faster than I was reading them. And I don't like the idea of having a bunch of books on my shelf that I haven't read. So I put myself on a book buying diet until reading through most of these. I have already broken that rule. I've bought like 3 or 4 books this year, which I accept of myself because I was traveling a little bit. And when I'm traveling, I like to go into local bookstores. And when I go into local bookstores, I like to support them by making purchases. So I got a little off track with the resolution, but I am still going to do my best to keep to the spirit of it and prioritize reading through the books that I already own rather than buying new ones when I'm thinking about what to read. And it's a Saturday morning, and I've decided that I'm spending the entire weekend on the couch reading. And that means that in deciding what to read this weekend, I went to my stack, I looked through the books that I already own, and I chose a couple that I'm going to read. Honorable mentions to these 2 books. I almost considered making these my reading for the weekend: Virginia Woolf's The Waves and E.M. Forster's Maurice. I do really want to read both of these books. I've owned them for like almost a year now, possibly over a year, each of them. And I was excited when I bought them because I've known about these books for a while and I do want to get around to them, but both of them feel like more kind of weighty emotional undertakings. I feel like these are books that I'm really going to want to like appreciate the beauty of the writing and the story and all of that. And to be honest, that's not the mood I'm in for my reading this weekend. I want to have a little bit of fun with my reading this weekend. So I ended up not choosing these, but I almost did. Instead of those 2, I'm going to go with these 2 for a double feature. I'm going to do Carmilla and Hungerstone. Carmilla is a vampire story from, I don't like the book jacket of that actually. I'm going to take the shiny jacket off because I don't really like the way it looks that much. This is much more sleek and nice. Carmilla is a vampire novel from, I think, the 1870s, which, if you know your 19th century Gothic literature, it means that it predates Dracula fairly considerably, I think like 20 years or something like that. The vampire in this story is the title character, Carmilla, girl vampire, and it's not heterosexual what goes on with vampirism in this book. I've read parts of it before. I don't think I've ever finished the whole thing. I browsed through it a little bit back in October when I was doing my Gothic curriculum, but it's been a long time, if ever, that I've actually read the whole thing. And as you can see, it's nice and short, and like even the print on the page is not that big. So I'm going to start my weekend with reading this one and just kind of, going through it at a nice quick pace. And once I've worked through Carmilla, I'm going to read Hungerstone, which is a contemporary retelling of Carmilla. I definitely get the sense just from the back cover that it is taking, creative liberties with the story of Carmilla. Also, I can tell from the comparative lengths that this is not going to be a one-to-one retelling of this. And I can also tell from the description on the back cover that this is going to take the somewhat more subtle sapphic themes in Carmilla and make them text rather than subtext. I was hoping that the weather would cooperate with me a little bit more. The day started out pretty rainy, and I really wanted a stormy backdrop for my weekend of vampire novels on the couch. Unfortunately, the sun is breaking through a little bit and the sky is looking kind of cheerful now. But despite the beautiful weather outside, I think I will still be able to give myself a nice cozy weekend. I'm going to curl up with these books. I'm going to make like a serious chicken stock, And I'm going to talk about what I'm reading while I'm reading it, pause every now and then in my reading to chat through my reactions to the books so far, and take you along with me on this weekend of vampire books and chicken stock, if you're into things like that. When I say I'm making a very serious chicken stock, I mean it, because this is my starting point. I made Hainanese chicken a couple nights ago, which to make that you poach an entire chicken in just water, but with a bunch of aromatics added, scallions, ginger, garlic, little bit of soy sauce, things like that. And so this is my poaching liquid. It is a broth already. It's got a little bit of viscosity to it, but it's not like gelatinous. But I also have the carcass left over from my Hainanese chicken. And I have a couple of chicken legs that I've had in the freezer for forever, and I have not actually gotten around to using them. And it's been in there for months. So at this point, I don't think I'm going to actually like cook something with the chicken legs. But what I can do is take this stock, take that chicken carcass, take these legs, add a couple more vegetables, and take my freezer bag of vegetable scraps. I think this is just celery tops and scallions at this point. Throw all of this together, let it simmer for a few hours, and then I will have a truly glorious, very serious stock. So I've read up through this point of Carmilla so far. I'm about to start chapter 5. It's quite a short book, so things move pretty quickly. The book starts off in this very classically Gothic way with somebody introducing a manuscript that they have come into possession of. The manuscript is written by a young woman detailing these strange, fantastical experiences that she had when she was about 16, and she wrote them a decade after the fact. And we learn in the introduction, the fictional introduction, that the woman who wrote these recollections is now dead. I'm not actually sure if she has a name now that I'm thinking about it, which might be a failure on me as a reader. Maybe I'm just not remembering it, but maybe they don't tell us her name. Anyway, we get into the manuscript of this young woman recollecting her fantastical experiences, and it begins with an anecdote from when she was just 6 years old, and she has this vivid dream of a beautiful young woman visiting her in the night. And at first the narrator is alone in her room and she's frightened, and when she sees this beautiful woman appear, she's comforted and she's joyful, and they fall asleep in each other's arms. But then the child wakes up to the sensation of as if 2 needles have been driven deep within her chest, and she screams, and the young woman kind of like slithers away. And then this woman narrating flashes us to 10 years in the future. She's 16 years old now, and she's been expecting that a young woman, the daughter of a general, was going to come stay at her house and visit her, and they'd hang out and become friends. But her father receives a letter from this general with the news that this young girl has died. And the general doesn't really give details of what happened, except to say that his hospitality was taken advantage of, and now he is on the hunt for a monster. And as the young woman is getting this story, she's out for a walk with her father, and there is this dramatic carriage crash that takes place in front of them. Like the horses kind of lose control, and this carriage partly topples over, and a young woman of about the narrator's age falls out and is stunned, and her mother is causing this great scene because she has to get somewhere in a rush and she doesn't have time to stay and allow her daughter to recuperate. And the father and the narrator say basically like, oh, well, we were going to have a young woman come stay at our house anyway. Why don't we just have this young girl who's been injured in the carriage accident recuperate in our house, because we were planning to have a guest and that one died, but we'll just sub in this one. And that is the plan that is agreed on, and the young woman is taken back to this house to recuperate. And this whole time, there's all this confusion, and this woman is stunned and a little bit injured, and so the narrator doesn't see her face until the next day, and she enters into the guest's room and realizes that this is the young woman from her dream from 10 years ago. The young woman from the dream is named Carmilla, and she tells the narrator, oh my God, this is so weird. 10 years ago, when I was 6 years old, I had a dream that you appeared in my room looking exactly the way you do now. So Carmilla is claiming to have had the same experience, but I mean, I know that I'm reading a vampire novel, so I know that she's lying. But the narrator is so charmed by Carmilla because she's so beautiful, and there's just something about her that is kind of magnetic. And so these two young women become very, very close. Very close. And there are a couple of strange occurrences. There are a couple of young girls in the village who die after claiming that they were visited by a ghost. They see a ghost, they're terrified, and then they kind of waste away over the course of a couple more weeks. And the father thinks that it's just like some kind of group hysteria. And the narrator is increasingly weirded out by the degree of intimacy that Carmilla is initiating with her, to the point that she wonders if maybe Carmilla is a teenage boy disguised as a girl to try to win her affections. Sometimes my strange and beautiful companion would take my hand, breathing so fast that her dress rose and fell with a tumultuous respiration. It was like the ardor of a lover. It embarrassed me. It was hateful and yet overpowering. She drew me to her, and her hot lips traveled along my cheek in kisses, and she would whisper, almost in sobs, "You are mine. You shall be mine. You and I are one forever." Are we related? I used to ask. What can you mean by all this? So there's this whole vibe to the relationship between the narrator and Carmilla, where the narrator is at once drawn to her, feels this magnetism, and also feels this real love for her, while also commenting on being occasionally repulsed by her, both by the fact that there is something strange just in her aspect, but also being sometimes repulsed by the passion that Carmilla has for her, which is, I mean, it all but says she's trying to fuck me. I know that I have read parts of this book before. I thought I had read more of it than I have, because when I got to the part where Carmilla's bosom is heaving with the passion of the lover, and the narrator is wondering if she's a boy in disguise because what other possible explanation could there be, I feel like I do not remember reading that. But as I've said before, I have a very poor memory, so it's entirely possible that I have read that passage before and was just as surprised by it then as I am now, because I never remember anything. Anyway, I'm starting my stock simmering, and I'm going to throw these chicken thighs into the oven to roast for a little bit and then add them into my stock pot. And while the chicken legs are roasting and the stock is simmering, I'm going to read the next few chapters of this book. I've read 2 more chapters now, and for one thing, I was totally wrong about the narrator not having a name. Of course, she has a name. What do I think this is? Rebecca. The narrator's name is Laura. Laura and her father have all of these old family portraits that they have had like restored recently, and they're looking over them, and one of them is an exact likeness of Carmilla. The portrait is labeled as being of a woman named Mircalla, Countess Karnstein, and Laura is saying, oh, you know, we are descended from the Karnsteins on my dead mom's side. And Carmilla says, oh, that's funny. I think I'm descended from the Karnsteins also, which, like, obviously you are in the portrait. The portrait is you. Laura decides that she's going to hang the portrait in her bedroom, which Carmilla is very pleased by, because this is indication that Laura loves her as much as she loves Laura. Shortly after this, Carmilla kind of extracts another offer of hospitality from Laura and her father by saying, oh, I think I'm going to leave. I should go find my mother, and having the father insist that she stay, and having Laura reaffirm that she really wants Carmilla there. So her presence as a guest is kind of like, you know, re-solidified through that. And then one night, Laura has another really intense dream. And during this dream, she once again has that sense that her breast is being pierced very deep by 2 needles. And after she awakes from this dream, she begins to become ill. She begins that kind of wasting away that is happening to the other girls in the village. But for her, it's taking longer. She is just kind of like wasting away. She's exhausted. She feels off. She starts having these thoughts of death that she's never had before. And in those thoughts, death doesn't seem like such a bad thing, but she's too weak and too like disoriented to even be alarmed by that. And she won't tell her father what's going on. And then she has another dream one night. And in this dream, she hears her mother's voice warning her to beware of the assassin. And so she wakes up really abruptly and she sees Carmilla standing near the foot of my bed in her white nightdress, bathed from her chin to her feet in one great stain of blood. I usually think of vampire novels as being very silly. You know, I think of Polidori's vampires just like caricaturish and goofy. And even Dracula, when I think of it, I think of him like scuttling down the walls of his castle like a lizard. And like the horror elements and the supernatural elements of it tend to be very silly to me. But that image of Carmilla bathed from chin to feet in blood is like, that's a pretty good one. That's a pretty good horror imagery. And then upon waking from this dream, she is terrified that Carmilla is being murdered. She's seized with this like certainty that that's why she would have been covered in blood. And so she rushes to Carmilla's door, which is locked from the inside. And she and everyone in the house is banging on it with no answer from inside. And when they finally get inside, they find that Carmilla is gone. So I have this much book left. I am going to settle back into my couch and read the end of this story and smell the delicious chicken aromas wafting from my kitchen. It smells so good. Okay, the ending to this was so good because they say in the prologue that Laura is dead, but they don't say how. And they still don't say throughout the entirety of the book. But the book ends with Laura saying that even though it's been years now, sometimes she still thinks that she can hear Carmilla's footsteps at the door. Which, like, they pretty definitively did kill Carmilla, I guess. But that ending at least gives the impression to me that, like, the effect Carmilla had on Laura was so lasting that even if Carmilla is gone, she did succeed in draining Laura's life away. Maybe they will be reunited in death as Carmilla wanted. I will have more to say about this for sure, but for now, I think I can't actually resist how nice of a day it is outside, and I might go for a walk.
It's so funny.
After my little post-Carmilla walk that I went on yesterday, my plan had been to jump right into reading Hungerstone and continue my vampire novel intensive, but my walk ended up leading me through, no will of my own, just through the momentum of movement to my favorite bar where I sat and had a beer outside in the spring sun. And then one of my best friends submitted her doctoral dissertation, and so I had to FaceTime her for like 4 hours, screaming in excitement and ranting about all the things we hated about the Wuthering Heights movie. And, next thing I know, it's 10 o'clock at night and I'm just sitting on the couch watching a Sean Connery Bond movie instead of reading my vampire book. It happens sometimes. There weren't really any surprises in the final chapters of Carmilla. Maybe that's just because, maybe it's because I've read it before and forgotten it, but kind of vaguely remembered the shape of the plot. But I think it's more likely that just we're pretty familiar today with how vampire stories unfold. And so there's not really that much suspense for a reader today about how things are going to happen, other than I guess maybe some suspense over whether any main characters might die over the course of the story's conclusion. Maybe a reader in the 19th century would have been more shocked and surprised at the ending, but it felt pretty obvious that we are moving towards this conclusion where obviously it's going to be revealed that Carmilla is a vampire and that she is the monster who killed the general's daughter. Not his daughter, actually, his niece. The general comes into town and he meets up with Laura and her father, and they go together to kind of investigate the ruins of the old Karnstein castle. And while they're there, the general is telling the full story of how his niece died. And it's, of course, basically the exact story that's currently happening to Laura. And in these final chapters, we get a little bit more discussion of what a vampire is and how the whole vampire victim dynamic works. And it's explained that there are some people who the vampire will just straight up kill all at once, but there are some who the vampire will form a deeper attachment to. And that I think the exact phrase used was that they seem to want sympathy and consent from these special people. Yeah, it uses an artful courtship and seems to yearn for something like sympathy and consent. So obviously that's what was happening with Carmilla and the general's niece, and it's what's happening with Carmilla and Laura. Anyway, the story unfolds again how I think it was pretty clear that it was going to, with it being revealed that Carmilla and Mircalla and Millarca are the same woman and are also the, Countess of Karnstein. They find the Countess of Karnstein's coffin and they open it and it's Carmilla inside. And she's floating in a pool of blood, which again, the blood imagery in these couple of horror moments were pretty effective to me. I was like, that's gnarly. Anyway, they stake Carmilla / Millarca / the Countess of Karnstein, and she dies. Or does she? I think she does. I think that probably the book isn't actually leading me to be suspicious as to whether she dies, but I really like the impression that I was left with after that final sentence where Laura is saying that even though so much time has passed, she still sometimes feels that she hears Carmilla's footsteps at the door. Now that I have finished this little one, it's time to dig into Hungerstone. With Carmilla being so fresh in my mind, I'm just curious for one thing to see how this book engages the original story and where it's going to diverge from that source material. But there's definitely also a few things that I found interesting in Carmilla that I'm kind of hoping will be in here in some capacity. One is obviously the element of hospitality, because I always like to look for that in something I'm reading. It felt so strategic the way that Carmilla was extracting these invitations from her victims and insinuating herself into these households as a treasured guest. And so I'm curious whether there is going to be some element of hospitality like that in this telling of the story. I'm also the descriptions of Laura when she was under Carmilla's spell and basically dying where she talked about having unexpected and unfamiliar thoughts of death, where the idea of death wasn't frightening, it was almost exciting or peaceful to her. That was interesting to me in Carmilla, and I'm curious whether that will be present here as well. And then I also just want to see, as I'm reading this, how the elements of hunger and appetite play in, because, you know, it's called Hungerstone. This little blurb subtitle here is, "For what do you hunger?" There's imagery of food all over this cover, and so I love a book where food is weird and like sensual, and the descriptions of food and hunger are tagging in other forms of appetite and just all that, like, you know, emptiness and consumption and hunger and embodied desire. I'm assuming also that the romantic or sexual relationship between the two women in this will be, I don't even want to say more explicit, because it was explicit in Carmilla. I thought it was going to be way more like, you know, understated, but we can tell that there's, you know, a sensual element to this friendship. Like, no, that was straight up. Carmilla was just like coming on to Laura pretty explicitly. And so I wouldn't say that there is subtext that needs to be made explicit in terms of the sapphic dimension to the relationship, but the sense was definitely in Carmilla that Laura isn't reciprocating those feelings. She's very drawn to Carmilla, but she's also kind of putting up distance, and she describes a feeling of like discomfort and repulsion when Carmilla is more explicitly romantic and sexual with her, which could just be, you know, internalized whatever, but it could also be that in this book, it's more just the vampire coming on to the woman, whereas in this one, it might be more mutual. There might be an actual like consummated relationship, or just a mutual attraction between I don't think she's Laura in this, Lenore. She's Lenore instead of Laura. That is much more Gothic. Anyway, I think I will stop speculating on what's going to happen when I start reading this and just actually start reading it. So from my chicken adventures yesterday, I ended up with a lot of goodies. One of the reasons that I wanted to roast the chicken thighs yesterday was just to get a little bit of extra flavor on them, but I also wanted to render out all of the fat from the chicken skin. So I have these crispy pieces of chicken skin left over, and I have all of this chicken fat. There's a little bit of olive oil in here too, but it's mostly chicken fat. Schmaltz. And of course, I have my magnificent broth. I ended up simmering the broth for about 9 hours, and this is the result. And actually, there's a little bit of chicken fat left on the top of this that I can scrape out a bit and add into that. That's broth. That's a good broth. And now I'm going to make the kind of soup that dreams are made of. I'm going to fry some shallots and garlic in chicken fat, and then I'm going to add rice and a little bit of broth and cook the rice separately in that, kind of the way that you would for Hainanese chicken for the rice that goes with that. And then I have like a piece of leftover seared chicken breast in my fridge, and I'm going to have some like vegetables and chicken and that broth and this rice and some chili oil and some cilantro. And it's going to be so good. So I'm about 100 pages into Hungerstone. I think I just finished chapter 6. And from the first page, really from the first sentence, I knew that this was going to be good. because really like the function of the first 3 pages of this novel are to totally like recontextualize the significance of blood in the story. There's kind of an obvious association for some of the things that blood might mean in a vampire story. I mentioned when I was talking about Carmilla that there were a couple of like horror images that really used blood to create a terrifying spectacle, but the opening pages of Hungerstone are describing the main character Lenore waking up to discover that she's gotten her period, and she's 30 years old. She's been married for a decade, and that entire time she and her husband have not had a child, seemingly have not even had a pregnancy. And so from these opening pages, it's clear that blood is going to have this particular significance for the character and for the story, and that's compounded as the book goes on. And in the first couple chapters, you get the sense that, well, you don't get the sense, you're told that Lenore is from this very high-born family and that her husband wanted her blood. Like, he married her because of her name and the bloodline that she represented. I'm not sure that the mandolin is actually the best tool for this. My shallots and garlic are not coming out quite as thin, actually, as I wanted. One of the books that I read this past fall, I think I actually read it in December, was called Midnight Rooms, and this was one of the contemporary novels that I included on my Gothic literature curriculum. And the main character in that novel has married into a family, and once she moves to their house, starts kind of losing her mind, but specifically losing her sense of time. Days pass when she thought only hours did, or she thinks that something has lasted very long, but it was really just the blink of an eye. And as she is losing her ability to keep track of the passage of time, there's a moment when she gets her period, and she latches onto that as a tangible marker of how much time has actually passed, because she might not be able to tell what's going on, she might not have a connection to the outside world, but her body is keeping the time through menstruating. I was really struck by that when I read that book, and now reading Hungerstone, I'm reminded of it now, not that the exact use of blood and menstruation is the same in these 2 books, but just that it is a similar use of menstrual bleeding as a narrative tool. I don't know, I don't have a strong analytic perspective on this, I guess, but I think it's an interesting connection between these 2 books. One of the big differences that you notice right away with Hungerstone as opposed to Carmilla is the age of the main character. Laura in Carmilla is, I think, 16 years old when this is taking place, and Lenore is 30. And there are several changes being made, some more superficial, some more substantive and dramatic to the original story of Carmilla, but there are also a couple things that are being maintained that I think is interesting. One is that the woman, the main character, Lenore in this case, encounters Carmilla through a carriage accident. Carmilla is tossed out of the carriage and needs to recuperate in Lenore's house. But there's an added layer to that in this telling, because when Lenore was 12, she was orphaned in a carriage accident. She was in a carriage with both of her parents, and they died, and she survived, and then had to go live with an aunt who we haven't seen much of yet, but clearly was a sinister, if not outright abusive, presence in her life. There's also a change just in basically the vibe that Carmilla has. She, in the novel Carmilla, is kind of just sweet and sleepy, and she occasionally has these outbursts, but for the most part she is just a very normal, sweet, beautiful young girl. But in Hungerstone, the character Carmilla is very weird and unsettling, and whereas Laura is kind of enchanted in a uncomplicated way with Carmilla, in Hungerstone we have already Lenore being unsettled and just kind of unsure of how to act around this person, and uncomfortable with the fact that whereas Lenore, is very focused on being the right kind of woman and behaving in appropriate ways that advance her reputation and conform to social custom, Carmilla is unconcerned with all of that. She speaks inappropriately. She doesn't seem to mind how she's perceived by other people, and she's so direct in conversation that it makes people, including Lenore, uncomfortable. But, and I was right in predicting this part, Lenore is also attracted to Carmilla, and she hasn't exactly named that sensation yet. In fact, the one time she's really, really experienced a feeling of attraction to Carmilla, she went through this whole mental exercising of trying to excise that thought and lock it away so that it wouldn't interrupt her performance of good wife, good woman. But she is, noticing Carmilla's body. She's drawn to her. She's thinking about her late in the night. So Carmilla is kind of more explicitly a threat, but also more explicitly attractive to Lenore. And I like what that's doing to the story, because it means that Lenore has to grapple with the fact that even though Carmilla is weird and inconvenient and making her uncomfortable, she still wants Carmilla around, and she doesn't know how to reconcile those conflicting feelings. And one of the changes that I'm really into, and again, I a little bit predicted this, or at least noted that I was curious about it, is the element of hunger and how Carmilla's power and her destructive effect on people is not explicitly vampirism so far, so much as it is that Carmilla is awakening these repressed hungers in the people around her, and they give in to their impulses in really extreme and really unsettling ways. So in the original novel, you have these peasant girls kind of just dying in the background. There's a funeral procession that goes by, and there's just mentions of the fact that these girls are being visited by what they think is a ghost and then just wasting away. And rather than that happening here, we have the working class women acting out in ways that are outside of their control by giving in to these weird hungers. There's one girl who works in the kitchen who is found just shoveling meat pies into her mouth, and she's fired, and she doesn't know why she did it, and she's really upset by what's happened. And then there's Lenore's personal maid. Lenore walks into Carmilla's room and sees her own maid kind of kneeling in front of Carmilla, plucking out hairs from the hairbrush, Carmilla's hairs, and eating them. And Lenore is really unsettled, and the maid, once she realizes what's happening, seems really uncomfortable and embarrassed and confused. And Carmilla is just kind of casual about it and says, well, yeah, she was hungry. She wanted to know what I taste like. Speaking of hunger, I have been frying my shallots and garlic in this chicken fat, and it smells amazing. And now I'm going to add the rice and cook this in some water and chicken stock, my goopy stock. And so far it seems like the hunger that Carmilla is awakening in Lenore is just a hunger for connection, because she has this shitty husband who's obviously cheating on her, and she feels so neglected. She was orphaned at a young age. She doesn't really have many friends, and she just craves this connection that she never feels with other people. I mean, that's my guess so far, is that is her main hunger, is a hunger for connection, but I don't know. I could be wrong. And maybe it's going to be a hunger for violence and she will kill her husband. That's what I'm rooting for. That's the outcome I want. Also, the husband obviously murdered someone a long time ago, and that secret is going to come out. And it is clearly some particularly shameful form of murder that he got away with because it was on a hunting trip of some kind, and Lenore knows about it. So I'm guessing that he killed a business partner or an older brother or something. Something that will further his evil financial interests. He's so evil. Anyway, I have my rice cooking now. That'll only take like 15 minutes. And I made just this kind of like salad-y slaw stuff of green cabbage and scallions with just a little bit of vinegar, lime juice, and sugar, like incredibly simple. And I'll let this sit while the rice is cooking and it'll get almost a little pickly, I guess. Sometimes when I'm cooking something, I work based off of purely an image in my mind of what I want the final result to look like. And today I have this image of a bowl of rich golden broth, and then there's a mound of rice emerging out of it, and a pile of crispy fresh vegetables and some slices of chicken, and on top of that there's a dollop of chili crisp, and there's herbs strewn all about the bowl. And it's, you know, rich and comforting and fresh all at the same time. And there's a nice slick of sesame oil and chicken fat on top of the soup, which also I keep on underlining in Hungerstone. It's a very slippery and oily book. There's all these descriptions of things that are slick and oily, and I am into it. Yeah, I'm into it. Okay, I'm just gonna, while the rice is cooking, clean up and finish my little bits of prep for this soup, and then I'm going to read more of this book and eat my soup, which I fully expect to be spectacular. I'm about to start part 2 of this book, part 2 of 2, I think. I am 230 pages in, about to begin chapter 15. Things are intensifying. I mean, Lenore and Carmilla just fucked. So that's one level of increasing intensity, but also the thing that brought them to the point of finally like taking that latent desire and making it explicit and actually acting on what's been brewing under the surface is that Lenore found out that her husband has been gradually poisoning her with arsenic. I'm not totally clear at this point if she's for sure going to die, like if he has managed to gradually administer a lethal dose, or if now that she knows he's been poisoning her, she can be really, really careful about what she eats and maybe survive. But I'm leaning towards thinking that she's gonna die. We've also gotten the backstory of the murder that the husband committed all those years ago on a hunting trip, and it was just like a heat of the moment. Somebody was being shitty and classist to him, and so he shot the guy. Honestly, I'm a little disappointed by that. I just feel a little bit underwhelmed by how that played out, but I might change my mind once I see the whole shape of the story. I'm getting also more and more this feeling that this is, while it is like a very direct Carmilla retelling, and there have been a couple of things that are exact recreations of scenes in Carmilla, there's also like a little bit of a general Gothic collage going on. We have obviously the main character's name being Lenore, which is the name of a famous poem. One of the characters made a little joke also about this big country estate they're living in and whether there is a mad wife in the attic. And at one point when Lenore was very ill and kind of hallucinating a little bit, she imagined that the wallpaper was moving like snakes, which of course reminded me of the yellow wallpaper. So I'm curious to see whether there are any other little Gothic references in the remainder of this. I want to predict, I want the house to burn down. This is one of my favorite, like, I don't know, micro conventions, or just conventions, I guess, of Gothic literature, is the house burning down. I just find it quite satisfying every time. And there's this whole like undercurrent in this book so far of mastery over the house, of Lenore going back and forth between feeling like this is her house while her husband is telling her this is his house. But then also when Carmilla arrives and she immediately makes herself at home, it feels like Carmilla is taking control of the house. I don't know, I feel like it could be narratively appropriate if the house burns down with Lenore and Carmilla inside it. As long as the husband dies, I'll be satisfied. This dude sucks. Anyway, I'm going to go curl up on my couch and finish reading these final 100 pages or so and find out what happens. After I finished reading Hungerstone on Sunday, I rounded out my little vampire weekend by watching the Gary Oldman Dracula, and now I've had a couple of days to kind of sit with these books and think about Carmilla and Hungerstone in connection to each other and just kind of like reflect back on this whole story. I don't know why it genuinely never occurred to me that this book might have a happy ending. I guess because I was coming off of reading Carmilla, which doesn't exactly have a happy ending. I mean, they kill Carmilla, but in this book, killing Carmilla wouldn't have constituted a happy ending. And of course, Laura dies at the end of Carmilla, so I think that I was expecting there to be something similar. I was hoping, obviously, for the death of the terrible husband, and I got that, but it never occurred to me that there could be a happily ever after for this book, but I'm so happy that there was. It was lovely. Lenore gets to kill her terrible husband in a way that he deserves, and now she gets to inherit all of his money and his nice big house, and she'll be able to institute better safety practices at his factory or whatever, and she and Carmilla can just live together and be happy. Interestingly enough, I guess Carmilla wasn't exactly explicitly a vampire. Like, there wasn't real drinking of blood, except, unfortunately, sexually. I didn't like that. I did not, it wasn't for me how when Lenore and Carmilla were hooking up, they kind of like bit each other and drank each other's blood. I didn't like that. I liked it analytically. Like, I appreciate the function that it had in terms of communicating their hunger for each other and their physical connection, and, you know, how it took the element of vampirism and carried it over into this book, but with a slightly different twist. But it made me unhappy to read that section. I thought that the use of hunger and of like unrestrainedly giving into your appetites in this book was a really cool addition to the story of Carmilla. One of the ways that Hungerstone kind of diverged from the original story in a way that was true to the spirit of the original, but adding in something new, especially with how that added to the characterization of Lenore, because more and more as the story goes on, you get these insights into how her entire life has been one of self-denial and kind of constantly forcing herself to go without affection, to go without family, to just take the yearning parts of her and sequester them away and just focus on self-preservation and not feeding the parts of herself that want more. And as part of that kind of self-denial and the detachment she felt from herself and her own life, I really enjoyed the way that those thoughts of death were incorporated that I mentioned finding interesting in Carmilla. That was definitely present in Hungerstone, but it was much more explicitly as a result of like a lifelong deep depression. I'm not sure why it did stick out to me so much in Carmilla, but I'm glad that it had caught my attention and that I was thinking about it, because I was then on the lookout for that while I was reading Hungerstone, and it was so much more deeply built out in Hungerstone. I mean, you know, again, the comparative lengths, you have time to do more in this, and there was much more kind of like character study of Lenore, much more background and much more digging into her feelings, her thoughts, and how these multiple factors in her life were kind of finally all coming to a crisis point at the same time. Her terrible marriage to her husband, her trauma over how she lost her family and how that threw her into this cold, abusive, neglectful household with her aunt, and her obsession with presenting herself in the correct way being, again, the right kind of woman, a good wife, a good high society woman, all these things that she's been trying to maintain in her life for so long are finally coming to their breaking point with that instigating factor of Carmilla entering into her house and forcing her to confront these feelings that she has that she considers to be inappropriate and that are challenging to the life she's trying to live and the detachment she's trying to maintain. So she has this just like long lasting, again, depression essentially that is worsening and worsening. And so when she is having these thoughts of death and when the prospect of death is seeming welcoming to her rather than frightening, it's a continuation of an ongoing point in her character and difficulty in her life. A lot of these elements connected to like performing a correct kind of femininity and suppressing desires or parts of yourself that are inappropriate or too jagged and having to, kind of confront somebody similar to yourself but different who mirrors back things about yourself that you try to ignore, as Carmilla does to Lenore. These are things that I have been thinking about and writing about a lot lately because I'm working on this Mad Woman in the Attic research/writing project that is consuming my life and driving me insane. And there's all of these novels that I've been reading and writing about that have components of that in them. And so it was really interesting to see how that is appearing in this book in a slightly different way, and then to see the point when Lenore's terrible husband tries to lock her up in an insane asylum to silence her, which is one of the things that I have been writing up some notes on lately. That part of this book, the husband threatening to have her declared insane and institutionalized, definitely goes into my mental list of the parts of this book that form that kind of Gothic collage of just pulling in many conventions and elements and references and using them to build out this story. Reading contemporary Gothic novels like this one after having done that whole curriculum project where I read like a dozen novels or more from between the 1760s through today, I find myself really interested in how contemporary authors are looking back over the history of the genre and pulling out all of these threads and themes and conventions and references, but using them to do something new. I definitely felt that this is what this book was doing. It is a retelling of Carmilla. It does have all of these references back to other Gothic texts and traditions, but it's not just repeating the same old things over and over again, so much as it is repurposing some material and kind of using Gothic convention and previous Gothic text as the scaffolding around which to build up an original story. An original story with a really satisfying ending. I'm so happy that Lenore got to murder her husband and then go live in a fancy house with her girlfriend. Fantastic.